So this is the second lesson of the big picture Old Testament study that we're doing. This lesson we're going to focus on geography, and we're going to break down the Old Testament into a series of events. And by learning just a basic grasp of the geography of the Old Testament, as you do read through the scriptures or hear stories or preaching or applications, it'll actually be helpful to have a picture in your head of kind of like where things are. It'll give you a better understanding of what's happening and where people are traveling to, and maybe some of the obstacles that they encountered. Because you hear in the Gospels, oh, they traveled from this town to this town, and you think, okay, they walked a mile down the street. But if you actually look at a map, that was a day's journey or 2 days journey, and you just kind of get a good feel for that. It helps understand things a little bit better. And we were talking about just how to understand such a large book, and the easiest way to do it is by breaking it down into smaller chunks. And so I'm going to break it down into just a sequence or a series of major events, and we'll just kind of look at the mountaintop peaks as you go through the scriptures in the Old Testament, and we'll just hit the high points, and we'll try to I'll get a chart up eventually for everyone where you can match up. You'll have like the event, the location, the central figure, and then maybe like an application or some way to help you remember it. And we'll go through all of those, and hopefully by the end of this you'll kind of have just a good overview of the Old Testament. So the Bible's a big book. It can be very intimidating. Some people pick up the Bible and it's just like, well, where do I start? I don't know where to start reading. I don't know how many times I've picked up the Bible, and I think I've read the first few chapters in Genesis, 30, 40 times, because it's like, okay, where am I going to jump into this? You almost look at it, as like a novel. You always want to start at the beginning, but it can be confusing. Early in the 19th century, there was a German engineer by the name of Charles Steinmetz, super smart mathematician, engineer, and there was a company, and they had a big, like, newfangled, complicated machine that they depended on to produce their product, and there was a problem with it, and it wasn't working, and they were losing money, and they were desperate. They were troubleshooting it. They couldn't figure out how to get this machine working again. It was just it was overwhelming. So they called in this Steinmetz guy. He came in and poked around the machine and took some measurements and stuff like that. Finally, he went over to one part of the machine and he took out a piece of chalk and he just put like a X on the machine. Then he packed up and left. And when the other technicians came in and they investigated underneath where the X he wrote, and they opened it up, and sure enough, like right under the X was the part that needed to be fixed. Like he just came in and knew, okay, this is where the bad part is, and so they were able to change the part and get the thing going. So then they get a bill from the guy for like $10,000, and they're like, "What in the world? He was in here for like half an hour, drew an X on our machine. Like this is an insane amount of money to charge us." So they like called him up. And like, you need to send us an itemized invoice. We need to figure out like why you're charging us such an expensive, amount. So we sent them a piece of paper, and it, said for services, drawing a chalk X on the machine, $1. Knowing where to put the X, $9,999. It's like, if you don't understand the big picture and how everything all works together, like it's easy to be clueless and you don't know, where to look for something. But if you understand the big picture and you know how all the pieces interact and work with each other, and you can see the story that flows through the Bible, you'll have a much better chance of like thinking, oh, I know where that is, or I know that application, or I can relate with that, or I can give you an example from the scriptures. So that's kind of our goal, just to get like this big overview of how everything works and fits together, so that when you're hearing preaching, or if you're witnessing to somebody or teaching somebody else, you'll just be that much better equipped to be able to bring them to the right place in scriptures. And it's good for Christians too to know and be familiar with their Bible. I mean, it's the tool that God gives us. We ought to be able to open it up and show people, like, this is what God gave us. This is how he's revealed himself to us, and be able to, like, help somebody. And it makes you a good testimony. God wants us to know his word. He wants us, it's not a mystery. He didn't give it to us and encode it so that nobody can understand it. He gave it to us, and he told us to study it. He actually commanded us that in 2 Timothy. He said, study to show thyself approved, so that you're not ashamed. If you don't study, well, you'll be ashamed. If somebody wants to challenge you on your spirituality and you're like, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the answer to that. It could be a little bit embarrassing. So we're told to study, and God expects us to study, and we will come to understand it if we put the time and effort into it. So let's break it down. Old Testament is 39 books. So there's 17 historical books, 5 poetical books, and 17 prophetical. Stumbling on the words, prophetical. So 17, 5, and 7. So there's different sections. When you pick up the Bible, it's not just like a novel that's just going to flow right through. The first 17 books are the historical section of the Old Testament, and that's from Genesis to Ezra. So if you're looking at trying to find some history in the Bible, you're going to want to go to these historical books, those first 17 books. And then you've got like Job through Song of Solomon that are considered like poetical books. It's like there's obviously wisdom in there, and Proverbs, and David has a lot of the Psalms that are like it's poetry and speaking to God and expressing deep emotions and feelings that the writers were experiencing. And then the last 17 books are prophetical, where you've got the Old Testament prophets, the major and the minor prophets, and they're speaking from God. They're speaking to Israel, and they're warning of things to come and judgment, and trying to encourage the people to do right. So if you break it down like that, if you know that there's historical books, poetical books, and prophetical books. So if you were trying to find, for example, like the story of David and Goliath, like what section of books would you look in? Right, you go to the historical books, because that's like part of the history of Israel, King David and his early days. Or say you just wanted to kind of learn how to praise God, and you wanted to learn some of the language and how to like praise God and worship him. So where would you go for that?
Psalms.
Yeah, you go to like the poetical books. So just if you can break it down and you can recognize the different sections, it starts, right off the bat, you can start understanding it and have it not be as intimidating. That, well, this part of the Bible is history, and this is poetry, and this is prophecy. You can kind of start to see already. It doesn't have to be this huge, overwhelming, intimidating book. So the Old Testament is non-linear. It means it's not a straight line. Non-linear is like a curve. Linear, if any mathematicians are here, that it's just like a straight line. Like y equals 2x. It's just like a linear line. But if you go like y equals x squared, then it's like a nice curve. That's actually like a bell. So the Bible's non-linear in that it's not like a novel that you just can pick it up and expect to read it from beginning to end and have it all flow together in one, easy to understand story. It jumps around. There's parts that will jump back and expound on other things. And if you just think you're just going to read it through, book by book, it could get a little bit confusing. So out of those 17 historical books that I had mentioned, 11 of them are primary historical. Like there's 11 of those books that are pretty linear, and if you just took those 11 books, it would give you the whole history of Israel throughout the Old Testament. And there's 6 of them that are secondary. And what they do is they'll repeat information or amplify stories and stuff. They'll give you more details, maybe an event from a different viewpoint, or from another country or another king, seeing the same event from another perspective. and that they give you like additional information on it. But if you were to take that out, you could still get the whole story through the primary historical 11 books. So I've got a chart here. If you look at those, the primary books, the primary historical books I've got in green, see like Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, the Kings. Those would read through like as pretty linear and as a story. But you've got like Job, which was probably written shortly after the flood in the time of Genesis, probably the oldest book in the Bible. And it doesn't quite fit with the rest of the story in Genesis, but it can shed some light onto, you know, what the attitudes of the time were. You look in Job, you don't see any reference to a temple, to a priesthood, to any sacrifices. So you can kind of see like this is an early time in the scriptures, and it'll give you some insight. And like Leviticus and Deuteronomy, you know, they're like stuck in there. And we've all done it. You're like reading through Genesis, Exodus, you get into like Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and it's just like you bog down, and it's like you almost feel guilty. Like, I know I should read this because it's scripture, but it's just boring. You know, it's like, I find myself sometimes like speed reading it, like just like trying to get the feel for the passage, like without really reading every word, because it can be intimidating. But those two books are not part of like the direct history. They give you some insight, they expound and give you more information. But if you were just kind of skip those and go to Numbers, you'd still get the whole story without, you know, any gaps that would leave like any confusion. During the time of the Judges, you've got Ruth. During the time of the Kings, with 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, during the time of like David and Solomon, you've got the books of the Chronicles, and giving you, you know, more information about the same time period, just from like a different viewpoint. You know, where some books may focus on the southern kingdom, the tribe of Judah, the other books will focus on like the northern kingdoms and like the kings of the northern tribes. So I don't know. I actually printed out this chart. I'll hand it out later. Just it's kind of a good reference to have. You can kind of see where things line up on a timeline. So like you can see if you were to read the prophet Jonah, he was ministering to a foreign nation. He was told to go to Nineveh, and you know that this was during like the time of the 2nd Kings. You know, he wasn't around during the time of Haggai. You know, that's after the 70 years of exile. So kind of just you can kind of get at a glance get an idea like who's preaching or speaking when. It breaks it down even the north and south kingdoms. The north kingdom had like Amos and Hosea prophesying to them. But I found this and I kind of cleaned it up and added color because I thought it was a really good reference. So it's time for some geography class. We're going to start learning some geography. So this is obviously a map of the entire world, and it's pretty big, and it's just amazing that out of this entire world, that little square there is the center of just so much controversy and strife, and just the kingdoms of this world are revolving around what has happened and is going to happen in that little square of land there. So if you were to zoom in a little bit, this little square of land where you've got Israel, just the laser pointer went off. So just this little tiny sliver here is Israel. So in the whole world, just the massive size of the world, it was prophesied that Jerusalem, that Israel would be a stumbling block to all the nations, and it have been. The whole world stumbles with what to do with Israel. And we've got like the modern nations like Turkey and Saudi Arabia on there now, but we'll look back and we'll learn what the original names were earlier. So we're going to actually memorize everything underneath that square right there. We're going to memorize the geography, well, just the major locations, the bodies of water. There's not a ton. I'm going to try to make it as easy as possible. A few people here might remember a map that looks something like that. I remember with when we were in Antioch, we learned how to draw this. We learned how to fill everything in. And we learned like all the events that go along with it. So, I printed these out in color on a black and white printer. So they're not the brightest. The water came out kind of dark. But I think the easiest way is to start with memorizing the bodies of water. So I'll hand out.
There's books underneath the bread to write in.
Take the book.
Big. Thank you. There you
The princess.
go. Please.
Do not get one.
Okay.
I have a book.
Nope.
That's for Jenna. She needs a paper, Sean.
Sorry. Oh yeah. Uh-oh. I'm hiding over there. All right. Here's pencils. So this is something great to know, because like if you're speaking to somebody about the Bible, you could just grab a napkin or a piece of paper and you could just quick sketch this out. And the goal is for you to be able to actually just kind of give like your own little quick 5-minute, big picture Old Testament presentation to somebody that's like intimidated by the Bible. You can say, oh, it's not that bad. Here, let me draw you a map of the Middle East. And just doing that, I mean, how many people can draw you a map of the Middle East centered around Israel? So we're going to start with bodies of water. So the big one on the left, Mediterranean Sea. I'll write that in there. I think Nile River is a pretty easy one. We know that that's down in Egypt. So if you're living in denial, you're probably in Egypt. All right. Let me know if I'm going too fast. I don't want to go too fast, but I don't want to go too slow either. Right in the middle of Israel, we got the Sea of Galilee there in the north. And certainly by the time we get into the Gospels, you hear a lot about the Sea of Galilee. So it's an important sea to know where it's located. And then you got that river flowing down out of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Jordan River. I know some of this might get a little bit crowded later on as we get filled with everything, but just wherever there's space, put arrows if you have to. And when we're all done, I'll hand out one that's actually all filled and everything anyway, so that you can have it as a reference, and I'll give some more blank ones that you can make copies of. And then Jordan River flows down into the Dead Sea. Okay, now there's two big rivers that flow up out of that body of water on the bottom right. The Tigris River. Anybody know what the other one is? Euphrates River. We kind of talked about that when we were talking about the land that's promised to Israel. Ultimately, when Jesus returns and sets up his kingdom, the original boundaries of Israel are to extend all the way to the Euphrates River. Like right now, if you see on a map, Israel is just this little tiny country right here. But someday, Israel's going to extend all the way along the Euphrates River, and and from the Nile, it'll be way bigger. And it's going to have to be. There's going to be so many Jews coming back and being restored. Okay, that little thing down over there, that's the Persian Gulf. Like my little bouncy? See, I told you, I'm learning how to do PowerPoint. Boink, boink, boink. I'm learning. So, yeah, we hear a lot about, Persian Gulf. Was that?
So I'll be impressed when they're all dancing around.
Yeah, I know.
At the same time.
Maybe one of these days I'll try to put sound effects with it. That'll be really my next step. But before I was doing like a separate slide for each time I added something, I'd put a whole new slide with just like one new text. But now I'm learning how you can just have one slide and just have like multiple texts like appear all over it.
You should incorporate like Google Earth, like some zoom in.
I was showing Mom that when I was putting this together.
He was.
You know, it's interesting. It's amazing how small this is. Black Sea is up there on top. And the Red Sea down there in Egypt, kind of like bunny ears poking up from the bottom. Or a peace sign. And up there in that upper right corner, we got the Caspian Sea. Well, that's it for the. So it's not that many. I forget. It's like, what is it, 10? Yeah, it's just 10 different bodies of water that we'll refer to. Now we'll go over the major locations. The ones that are already filled in there, you don't have to memorize them, but I mean, you can if you want. It'll just help to be more familiar with it. But I filled them in there just because they're not like major areas. Like Mesopotamia is just kind of like the ancient. What do they refer to it as? Like the cradle of life. Like even the evolutionists, they'll say that life probably originated around that point. You know, looking at the fossils and all that. Amazing that we have the creation story that actually tells us that life started around there, and then you've got the scientists that actually say the same thing, but it was billions of years ago, but same place. So we know better. So major locations. Garden of Eden, right down there where the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers join together down there. And the scripture tells us that God planted a garden eastward in Eden. The Garden of Eden wasn't just like one single place. It was part of a larger landmass called Eden. And the garden was just planted eastward in Eden. And it was right there where the Tigris and Euphrates River come together out of the Gulf. So this, very important right here, Canaan, back in the times of the patriarchs with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, getting into like Joshua, it was known as Canaan. And then Israel, it became Israel as a nation, and now we know it today, like people refer to it as Palestine. Even though the nation of Israel still exists there, that land in general is kind of known as Palestine. So if you know it by those three names, Canaan, Israel, Palestine, it's all referring to that same general location. And there's the capital of Israel. Right on the upper left of the Dead Sea there is where Jerusalem is located. All right, what did I just put there? Okay, there's Egypt, obviously down in the left corner there. Nation of Egypt. Little pyramids come up with it. And up there is Assyria. You hear a lot of references to the Syrians. And then the scriptures. And then there's Babylonia, kind of in between the rivers. That's where Babylon was. That's Tower of Babel would have been most likely down in there somewhere. That's where Israel was taken into captivity when they were carried off to Babylon. They were carried from Israel over here over to Babylon. We got Persia over there on the right. And Syria. You hear a lot about the Syrians. And what came up? Oh, that little dot down on the bottom there, that's Ur. It's a city. Anybody remember what's special about Ur? Ur of the Chaldeans. That's where somebody was living that God called to go into a land that Abraham. That's where Abraham was living when God spoke to him and told him to leave his homeland and go to a land that God would show him. And then up north there is another town called Haran. And that's where Abraham went when he left with his father. And Haran? Remember Haran?
No, I remember Polly saying something like, he ran. Like,
Oh, yeah.
ran.
He ran to Haran.
Yeah.
That's right. He ran to Haran.
Yeah.
Abraham. He was obedient. And then he stayed in Haran until when? Something happened. I just remember this. Like he used to ask us this in class.
He stayed in Haran?
Yeah, Abraham at the time stayed in Haran until his father died.
Oh,
And that's when he left and went into Canaan and Egypt and back to Canaan. Let's see. I'll even did something show up there? Oh, just my notes popping up here. Okay, so that's the major locations. So I'm trying to keep it as simple as possible, just bodies of water, major locations, and then we're going to break the entire Old Testament down into a series of 13 events. 13 events. We'll divide the Old Testament into 13 events, and we'll memorize all of these. We'll go through them like one by one. We'll be able just to list them. We'll chant them together. And this is what they are. Creation, down there in the Garden of Eden. Followed by the fall.
Should we write all this stuff, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, eventually.
We're going to have enough room?
If you don't, I mean, you can write arrows or whatever works for you. I mean, I'm not going to be a taskmaster here, but I'm just trying to get the information out so that you can understand where everything is.
So
But
like creation is the number one event, fall would be number two.
Right.
And you're doing 13 of them.
Yeah.
So we can just number them even, like creation number one.
Yeah, you could do that. I mean, I've got, on the map I'll hand out, I've got the events as lowercase letters, the places as uppercase letters, and the bodies of water as numbers. But we'll go over this each week. We'll review it, and like whatever works, easiest is fine. So, creation, fall, next major event is the flood. And then down there by we've got patriarchs. So you'll be able to rattle off the Old Testament as creation, fall, flood, patriarchs. And just by having this list that you'll memorize, you'll have a good idea of what the entire Old Testament is about. So you got the patriarchs down there, and bondage and slavery over there in Egypt. A little Pharaoh dude pop up. So then after the bondage and slavery in Egypt, we've got the Exodus. That's in that Sinai area there. Mount Sinai with Moses. And we'll move on to Conquest. That's actually a picture of like the walls of Jericho crumbling down. I know it's kind of small, but so then we move on to the time of the Conquest. It starts on the east side of the Jordan, and they cross the Jordan and start conquering. And then we go to the time period of the Judges. And that's followed by the time of the kingdom with King David. We have a unified kingdom ruled by King David. Sorry, it's kind of small and it's getting crowded. A lot happens in that little area, so there'll be a lot of arrows. So don't be afraid to write stuff off to the side and put arrows to it, because obviously that's the center of a lot of activity. So then the divisions happen, and the kingdom Israel divides into a north and a south. So I put the arrow kind of pointing to the north part there with Solomon. Followed by the exile and captivity over in Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar and his dream of his statue there with the gold head, and silver and bronze, clay, iron. And then after they're in captivity for 70 years, some of them come back for the return, and some of the Jews go back to Jerusalem. So you're going to need arrows because they come back to Jerusalem there. So then after they return to Jerusalem, that's where we have called silence. There's 400 years where God's not speaking through the prophets anymore. He's not doing any miracles or working through Israel at the time. And this is the time period that where like the Pharisees and the Sadducees come from during that 400 years. That's where they start building synagogues, because by the time Jesus comes along, they're going to the synagogues, but that didn't exist before. You were supposed to go to the temple to worship. So during that 400 years of silence, there's just so many people were scattered, and the temple was being worked on. They created the synagogues, and the Pharisees and the Sadducees kind of came up, and that's where they come from. So the goal, to get a good understanding of what the Old Testament is, you should be able to kind of come up with a quick sketch if somebody wants to understand, what's the Bible all about? I mean, it's such a big book. The Old Testament has so much in it, and you'll be able to say, oh, it's not that difficult. Let me show you. So you just kind of grab a napkin or, throw a couple bodies of water around to generally give you an idea of the landscape there. And you say, well, about 4,000 years ago, or 6,000 years ago, 4,000 BC, God created everything, and he created the Garden of Eden, and he made man and put them in the Garden of Eden right around here. But man became disobedient, and they partook of the forbidden fruit. They fell. God cast them out of the garden, so they fell. So you got the creation, the fall, and then mankind multiplied and reproduced and spread out. But unfortunately, they became super wicked and very evil, and God was displeased with them. So he had to destroy man with a flood that filled the entire world. But Noah found grace with God, and God spared Noah and his family through an ark. So then, after the flood, they got off the boat and started, multiplying again and spreading out. And God decided to, you can actually throw the Tower of Babel in there too. I probably should have put a little tower in there, but you could, God told them to spread out. They disobeyed. They built a tower. Then God came down and confused the languages and scattered mankind from that tower. And a little while later, God called a man named Abraham from down here, from Ur in Chaldea. And he told him, get out of your father's home and go to a land I'm going to show you. And God made some big promises to that man. He promised him a land, and he promised him generations of seed that was going to be uncountable. Promised he was going to bless them and multiply them. So Abraham obeyed, traveled with his family up to Haran, stayed there until his father died, and then followed God's command and came down here into this land of Canaan. And there God showed him all the land and promised him, you're going to be able to have all this land. This is all for you and your generations after you forever. It was an unconditional covenant God made with Abraham. Abraham didn't have to do anything to receive it. It was something that God promised, and God will do it, and it will be fulfilled eventually. And so after the patriarchs, after Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, down through his son Joseph, started having children, they found themselves during a drought. They went down to Egypt because they had food down there. While they were down there in Egypt, the Jews started multiplying, became so numerous that the rulers of Egypt and Pharaoh became intimidated by them, and they were afraid that if they were ever attacked, the Jews could rise up and side with their enemies. And so the Egyptians put the Jews under bondage and slavery. And they were there in Egypt for 400 years, bondage and slavery. And they cried out to God, and he heard them, and he raised up a deliverer named Moses. Moses led his people out of Egypt. He led them right through the Red Sea, right through there, parted the waters, led them through the Red Sea on dry ground into the wilderness of Sinai, where God met with Moses, and he made another covenant with the Jewish people. So this time it was a conditional covenant called the law. Under the law, God said, if you obey me, I will bless you, and I will protect you and keep your enemies away. If you disobey me, I'm going to punish you, and I'm going to punish you bad. So it was a conditional covenant. So after they left Egypt, they quickly started grumbling and complaining, and they didn't trust God. So God had to punish them by wandering around for 40 years in the wilderness. And I think it would have been, I forget the actual length of travel, but it's like a 5-day or a week walk between like Egypt and
So it was
Israel.
1 week walk, and yet they went
And
through
they,
for
and they,
40
yeah,
years.
and they were like 40 years, lost. And I don't know if it was because during the day the cloud covered the sun, and at night the pillar of fire maybe blocked out the stars. They couldn't navigate. They didn't know where they were going. Maybe I don't know. But anyway, 40 years they spent wandering until a man named Joshua rose up, and God commanded Joshua to lead the nation of Israel into the Promised Land and start conquering the Promised Land. So they came up and started conquering the Promised Land. Conquered Jericho, across the Jericho River, started taking over the land. And so eventually they conquered a good chunk of that land. They never conquered everything. God promised all this land, but they conquered this area and here. And so they wanted to set up a governmental system, right, to govern themselves. So we enter the time of the judges. And that's where there were judges that, this is before there was no king. It was just like a spiritual or a military type leader who would just kind of rule over the people. And God spoke through that judge, and he ruled over the nation. And it was kind of an up and down time. There was times that were good and there were times that were bad. But ultimately, people got tired of judges, and they said, we want to be like the rest of the nations, and we want to have a king. And God wasn't happy about that, but he's like, okay, you guys want a king? You guys can have a king. So ultimately, with a little failure with King Saul, we get King David, and we get the actual kingdom of Israel set up. And David did a lot of fighting and a lot of wars to try to conquer as much as he could. He had a very violent life, and he did a lot of fighting. He wanted to build a temple for God, and God said, you've shed too much blood. You can design the temple and set everything aside for it, but your son Solomon is going to build the temple. So we move on to King Solomon, who, God asks him, what do you want from me? And Solomon prayed for wisdom. Help me to be a good, wise leader. So God blessed him, made him a great, wise leader. And under Solomon, the kingdom had a time of peace. But Solomon, where David loved God with his whole heart, Solomon was half-hearted. And ultimately, later in Solomon's life, he fell away and was even worshiping idols. But God made a promise. We looked at the Davidic Covenant a few weeks ago, where God promised David, your son, will be the heir to the throne, and your lineage will always be on the throne. And even if he sins and falls away, I will punish him. I will discipline him with the rod of men. God will use nations and other countries as punishment against them, but I will not remove him like I did with Saul. It was an unconditional promise God made to David. And after Solomon, during his rule and afterwards, that one kingdom that was known as Israel split, and the north rebelled and became the 10 of the tribes went north, 2 of the tribes stayed down here, down in the south. So it was like Judah and the half tribe of Benjamin down here, and the other 10 tribes went up here. Now during this time, especially the north, they were very wicked. They were just rebellious, they were idolatrous, they wouldn't follow the law, and God promised, he made that conditional covenant. If you don't follow my law, I'm going to punish you. So during this time, when the kingdom is split, he starts sending the prophets. And this is where we get, Isaiah and Jeremiah and Daniel and all those minor prophets. They're all coming to this split kingdom and saying, you need to repent, you need to repent. God's going to bring judgment. And they, most of the time, wouldn't listen to the prophets. And God finally got fed up and said, okay, you've rejected me, I'm going to punish you and just kick you right out of your land. So along comes Nebuchadnezzar, comes over here, takes the northern kingdom, takes all those 10 tribes, takes them captivity. Judah was not much better, but enough so that they lasted a little bit longer in the land, but ultimately they had the same thing, and the kingdom of southern kingdom of Judah was taken into captivity here. For 70 years, Israel was in captivity over here in Babylon, and that's like when we get in the time of Daniel, and when Daniel's having his visions, and he sees a lot of stuff about the end times. And after those 70 years, there's a very important declaration that was made, where the leader, that Babylon ends up being conquered by Media and Persia. Combined forces come in, take over Babylon, and that leader makes an important declaration saying, okay, Jews, you can go back home and rebuild your temple and rebuild your walls. And that relates with that prophecy we looked into of Daniel, where God says there are 70 years determined upon your people, and from the going forth of the commandment until Messiah comes. So that commandment that was given and when they were in captivity there is an important commandment that we looked at, that kind of started that prophetic time clock ticking with Israel. So a bunch of Jews came back. We get to the time of like Ezra and Nehemiah rebuilding the temple, and working to try to get the walls and the streets built up there. But there was still a lot of unrest, and there was still a lot of oppression by other nations. And it kind of became a time where God just didn't really speak very often. The prophets weren't speaking anymore. God wasn't actively involved in their daily life. And you had the Pharisees and the Sadducees rise up, and the synagogues rose up during that 400 year of silence. And that silence was ultimately broken when God started working again and brought John the Baptist and then Jesus. And then we have the Gospels and what Jesus did and his sacrifice for sin. And that ends the Old Testament. So you can that's the goal here. So you can just kind of take somebody, walk them through the whole Old Testament on a napkin or a paper if you have a copy. And that's really it. The Old Testament's not, there are deeper things, and you can, like I said, you can take an overview, just a general, like a high look at things, or you can zoom way down into the finer points. Like you can get into the law and the details of you can look at just one candlestick in the temple and study that thing and figure out, what does that candlestick mean? It means something. And you can get stuff from it. Or you can just take this, there's a temple. The temple represents something. The priest represents something. Or you could, what's the priest wearing on his feet? What do his shoelaces look like? And it's just however far you want to zoom in or zoom out, the Bible's ready for you. And it just doesn't have to be intimidating. That's just a general overview of what the Old Testament is. And we're going to break it down and look at those different events, creation, fall, flood, patriarchs, week by week. And just by the end of it, you'll just have a good overall, understanding of what each of those things are and, how to explain them and understand them and even apply them to your own life. And then even as we get into other new stuff in the New Testament, we can refer back and we'll actually see the pictures in the Old Testament. We'll see a picture of, Abraham you know, and being told to sacrifice his son, you know, picture of Christ. You know, there's a lot of types and pictures that we'll see how they match up. But that's pretty much it. Just I want you to, we'll practice those maps. I'll hand out some blank ones, and I'll hand out ones that have you know, all the whole key on it. I might have to try to come up with a better printout because it's a little bit dark.